Hello and welcome to Paul on Politics, our regular review of all the recent news live on KMTV. On this week's show, we'll be examining Theresa May's latest charm offensive in Brussels and why she turned to Facebook to try to put the fears of EU nationals at rest. And while those Brexit talks go on and on and on, there's another warning of the possible impact of Brexit on the Port of Dover and the stresses and strains Kent could be under. We'll also be considering why Kent apparently still needs so many MPs after a Boundary Commission review recommended there should be no change in numbers after all. With us on the panel tonight are guest Professor Amelia Hadfield from the University of Kent and Labour councillor Clive Johnson of Medway Council. Thanks to both of you for joining us. But first, the government has been warned that it needs to sort out all the controls before Brexit looms in 2019. Cllr Webster reports.
Auditors have warned that delays and disruption may occur at border entry points like the Port of Dover if the government fails to take steps to prepare for the UK's departure from the EU. A report by the National Audit Office says border controls will need to change and expresses concern that arrangements may not be ready by 2019. It also warns that the port does not have the capacity to inspect and check more vehicles, and it would be wrong to think that border controls can continue by doing more of the same. It predicts bottlenecks and congestion as more time will be needed to check European lorries. In their report, they state that the ability to scale up operations will be constrained by physical and other infrastructure. For example, there are a limited number of inspection bays available to search incoming traffic at the Dover port, and there are physical constraints on creating new inspection bays. The report concludes that the port needs to find creative solutions and unique approaches for any special circumstances that come up in the process of Brexit and after. Meg Hiller, who chairs the Committee on Public Accounts, doesn't hold out much hope. In a statement today, she said, "This report underlines the sheer scale of the task ahead. It's difficult to see how practically the government will be able to deliver any of these huge changes in time." As negotiations push through slowly in Brussels, March 2019, our deadline for Brexit seems like it's getting closer and closer.
Well, Clive, we've had reports like this and warnings before. Is there a bit of sabre rattling going on here, or are these concerns genuine, do you think?
I think they're genuine, Paul. The Leave campaign made a number of rather glib assurances about how easy exit from the European Union would be. I had my doubts about those assurances, and I think this National Audit report indicates just how problematic leaving the EU will be.
But it's hard to countenance the idea that the government's just going to say, well, that's where we are and we'll have to deal with it, if it happens.
Well, we're 15 months since the referendum. We've got another 15 months before the date when Article 50 is enacted. The report says that from that point, the number of immigration determinations may go up by 230%. The number of customs decisions may go up 360%. We don't have the infrastructure for that at Dover.
Let's bring in Amelia here. I mean, it is difficult to foresee how some of these things that the National Auditor wants to happen are going to happen. Is the clock ticking against us rather than for us?
Heavily against us. I think, Clive, you're quite right. The report makes for a very sober reading indeed. It first of all talks about the sheer number of entry points into Britain. I think that probably will come as a surprise to many. It's in the hundreds.
But the Port of Dover is one of the largest.
It is. Heathrow and Dover really are the two biggest, and for citizens and residents of Kent, it's Dover that we have to be most concerned about. I think what the report suggests is that we're running out of time. They're talking about a pressurised time environment. They're also talking about the sheer amount of land that is going to have to be looked at and ring-fenced in order to be able to provide additional space for bays. And beyond that, just the sort of carrying capacity of customs officials to know what they're looking at in terms of turning around people and turning around goods. So you've got probably a skill problem, you've got a time problem, you've got a land-based problem, and I don't see, in terms of what the government is looking at this point, any clear, simple instructions to help the Port of Dover move forward on this.
Clive, the answer surely is to have a few more lorry parks dotted in and around the county.
I think that wouldn't necessarily solve the problem. It's much deeper than that. We have the border force has lost 4% of its workforce over the last few years. you can't just establish a workforce overnight. Recruitment and training needs to be happening, if not now, in the very near future. It's not simply a physical infrastructure problem, it's an administrative workforce issue as well, and the lead-in times are quite long.
Okay, well, that leads us on to the kind of latest round of Brexit talks in Brussels. Amelia, Theresa May seems to be playing soft cop this time around. What's your take on her kind of charm offensive via Facebook? And
Not great. I was rather dismayed to see the way in which she used this. It went out at, I think, sort of 11:30 p.m. on a Thursday night, literally as she was heading to Brussels, as if she thought, gosh, I've not actually dealt with the EU-UK citizen issue. I'll just put together a quick page on Facebook directed specifically to the EU citizens here in Britain, very reassuring, saying you're welcome, your families are welcome. We'll have a sort of settled status for people who've already lived here for 5 years, but not going much beyond that. And I think the member states, 27 heads of states in Brussels, have seen that, have seen a total lack of development on Ireland.
Let's have a listen to what some people in Kent thought about this idea earlier.
It's possibly only right. After all, we've got 4 million of us over there, so why not let the status quo stay over here? After all, they're doing very, very useful jobs, which many of us wouldn't want to do.
They're part of our population. I don't know, probably the majority of them take the jobs that, well, most British people are quite pompous and don't want to do the jobs that most European citizens are happy to do. So they probably do the most menial jobs that we don't want to. So they're probably a bigger contribution than most of us.
They bring different cultures. They can bring different culinary ideas. And their children can help our children to understand different cultures.
Whether you're talking about in the city, whether you're talking about in the care homes, where my father is, so I know this there, whether you go to private hospitals or public hospitals, there's lots of EU people here. They're doing good work, contributing, and we're an open society, aren't we?
Well, Clive, there's some sympathy there for the plight of EU nationals, isn't there? And does that surprise you, given the outcome of the referendum?
I think the tone is changing. I think it's changed over the last few months as the reality has struck home, and people have realised the extent to which we depend on EU nationals in the health service, in other public services. They're our neighbours, they contribute to our economies, and I think people are beginning to realise the importance of that they have in our community, and also as one of the people in the package said, how many of our own nationals are living and working abroad very successfully. So I don't think Theresa May will have got very many likes for her Facebook page. I think
you didn't like it yourself then, presumably?
I didn't, no.
Is she a friend of yours?
Not now.
No, she's probably going to do away with me as a friend on Facebook now. But I think there is an important change in how people are thinking about things, and so there was so little in that people could actually depend on. It was a statement of intent, it was warm words, it wasn't anything definite. And I think what we should have done very soon after the referendum was to say unilaterally, EU nationals are welcome.
I mean, it was pretty open-ended, wasn't it, in terms of the commitments? No precise details.
Absolutely.
And she said it before. So, I mean, is her authority diminished by doing something like that?
It's a combination of being tardy and repetitive. So it's overdue, and yet there's no specifics. And she should have come out much, much earlier, giving clear and long-term guarantees to the very large numbers of EU citizens here. And I think that would have served to be a positive signal to member states as well.
So what's holding her back? Is it the kind of right of the party which is
possibly
restricting her limit?
I think the argument has changed. I think, as Clive was saying, specifically here, in Kent, we have a clearer understanding of the huge dependency that we have in terms of rural economy, healthcare, higher education as well. I think that message is now slowly beginning to get through.
Why didn't people realise that at the time, though?
I don't think we articulated it clearly enough in the lead up to the referendum, and we didn't look specifically at the ratio, if you like, of EU citizens working in hospitality in London, for example, or rural economy here in Kent. So although the message is getting through now, I think Theresa May is only just realising that she's going to have to accept that we have this core base of EU citizens working in Britain, and that they're not to be bargaining chips. I think the member states took they took very much akin to the way in which she tried to trade on them and said, well, you can't. It's not a chip.
Clive, I mean, this issue of bargaining chips is interesting, isn't it? Do you think her emphasis and the government's emphasis on their readiness to walk away without a deal is focusing member states' minds?
I think that the member states have their own agendas. I don't think they see themselves as being driven by Britain's agenda particularly. The German one of the German MEPs was on the news a couple of days ago saying, as far as we're concerned, Brexit isn't a central issue for us. We've got a number of issues that we're addressing.
Amelia, do you think the no deal line has focused the attention of some of the people she's...
Yes, I think so. I think it's horrifying for a number of member states.
Horrifying, but yeah. it might get the deal.
I think they're trying to sort of push Juncker and Tusk to be clearer in terms of their ability to suggest.
And to be fair, they've been a bit more or less mean-spirited, perhaps.
Possibly. Actually, I mean, Tusk himself said yesterday that although there hadn't been sufficient progress, he felt that some advancement had been made. So there was a sort of softly approach to some extent.
Okay, well, when we come back, why does Kent still need so many MPs? And are Oxford and Cambridge universities elitist? Find out more after the break. Welcome back to Paul on Politics Live on KMTV with our guest Professor Amelia Hadfield and the Medway Labour councillor Clive Johnson. Now, David Cameron promised to reduce the number of MPs from 650 to 600 to save money, but the latest proposals for a boundary shake-up leave Kent exactly where it was. Harry Peat has more.
Since 1940, Parliament has asked the Strategic Commission to regularly review the number of people represented by each MP. This means that the constituencies change from time to time to make sure that an equal number of people is represented by each Member of Parliament. This time around, the Boundary Commission has also been given another task, to reduce the number of MPs in the Commons from 650 to 600. In Kent, all change and no change. The county currently has 17 constituencies and will keep that number after the reorganisation. But 2 of them will also include voters from East Sussex. Let's have a closer look. Tunbridge Wells will be renamed Tunbridge Wells and Crowborough to include 6 wards from the East Sussex borough of Wilden. The constituency will also move westwards, and much of the Kent parts that had previously fallen within Tunbridge Wells now go to a new constituency called Mid-Kent and Ticehurst. Maidstone, which is currently split between Maidstone and the Weald, and Faversham and Mid-Kent, becomes much more centred on the town, and will also include Parkwood and Shepway North and South wards. Faversham and Mid-Kent would disappear, and Faversham would move to a new constituency with Canterbury, called Canterbury and Faversham, which also includes Aylsham from the borough of Dover. The Boundary Commission is using the electoral register from 2015 to divide up the country, but much has changed since then. 2 general elections and a referendum drove people to register for their chance to vote. So are these constituencies fairly split?
The fact of the matter is, though, that the legislation says that is the register that we have to use. We don't have any discretion ourselves. You can have an argument about whether that's, it's changed too much in the intervening period. Does it make it sort of already outdated? The bottom line is you have to pick a point in time and work with it. You can't constantly keep moving the goalpost because it's quite a long, convoluted and complex process what we go through. So you have to pick your point and work with it. And it will all get self-corrected in the next review when that comes along, because it happens every 5 years now. So it will all come out in the wash eventually.
But these proposals are not final. You have until the 11th of December to voice your concerns, and the Boundary Commission received more than 25,000 suggestions over the last 2 consultations.
Go and check out our website at bc2018.org.uk. Make sure you respond by December the 11th, which is the closing date, because this is the very last chance you'll have to contribute to the process.
Amelia, before we get on to the wider issues, you've got an insight into why Labour might be a bit unsettled in their newest seat of Canterbury. Why is that?
Possibly. Rosie Duffield, of course, was the shock winner in our recent general election and, of course, took Canterbury. But that constituency is attached to Whitstable. And Whitstable, I think, was very, very ardently supportive of Labour at that time. But now, with the boundary changes, it's going to be detached from Canterbury, and Canterbury is going to be attached to Faversham. And Faversham is the stomping ground, of course, of Helen Whately, who is Conservative. So there's a degree of expansion and also contraction. So Rosie's going to have to figure out whether she wants to try to fight a blended constituency, which probably is going to be tougher for her. It may not represent her sort of core interests as well. And Helen's going to have to figure out whether she wants to try to take on Rosie or opt for a seat where perhaps somebody like Roger Gale, if he's going to step down.
You know, what I was told was that Labour didn't just rely on support from those core supporting areas, but managed to get voters from Chartham and some of the villages around, which previously would have been strongly Conservative.
Absolutely, and crucially the universities as a whole. So it's to some degree it is all change. At the same time, the numbers aren't shifting. We're still going to have 17 MPs. What you're seeing, I think, is an extension of some of the counties across the county lines, but also I think a ring fencing around places like Maidstone and Ashford, so sort of a rural expansion and urban tightening, if you like.
Clive, what's your take on the Medway situation there? Because those 3 seats have had changes in recent years, haven't they?
They have. The proposal is that the ward of Lordswood and Capston would be added to Gillingham and Rainham. Residents, when that was proposed before, weren't happy with that, and there's already a petition against it.
Let's put it bluntly, politically, do these changes or proposed changes suit Labour or suit some other party?
I think on balance they're likely to be strengthening Conservative voters in those constituencies. But I think there is another issue which is to do with community cohesion and the appropriate linkage of wards to their constituencies. So Lordswood and Capston has always been a Chatham and Alresford ward. They don't see themselves as being part of Gillingham. They took against that proposal last time. We've now got under the proposal the new Chatham and Alresford seat, which at one end is Chatham High Street and all the way down to Kings Hill.
Very quickly, in the round, is this good for Labour or not particularly good?
Not particularly good for Labour, I don't think. I don't think it's allowing them to expand what might be some of their new areas, particularly in Canterbury.
OK, well, the clock is against us, so we're moving on. And this week, a report came out suggesting that Oxford and Cambridge universities were still out of reach for all but the top 2 social classes. So we asked students at the University of Kent if they'd ever considered applying elsewhere.
Old teachers would always be like, oh, you should consider it, but I never did. Yeah. Just because I just thought you have to be a certain calibre to go there, and I'm not really on there, so...
Yeah, same. I just didn't have the path given towards me as well from my teachers. Like, there was never an option from my teachers as well.
I've thought about it, like in school we used to have like Oxford come, like people from the university come to my school, or Cambridge, because I went to a grammar school, so we had like opportunities like that. But I feel like even then I still never consider it. I didn't think that I would be able to go there.
For me personally, no, I wasn't ever an option I'd consider. For probably multiple reasons like cultural differences and stuff like that, but yeah, for me personally I haven't actually considered it, no.
I'd say the same thing, because obviously when someone mentions that kind of uni, I think it's higher up. A lot of people from our background won't necessarily have that opportunity, in my opinion, hence why I wouldn't really go to choose that kind of thing.
Yeah, and you do hear loads of stories of people who do have the grades and don't make it.
Yeah.
And they think that the fact is because they're ethnic, and so yeah, I don't know if that's how they decide upon who gets in or not.
Well, Amelia, David Lammy, the MP who got these statistics, raises some very important points. But having said that, I mean, do you think we're just a bit too hung up on Oxford and Cambridge universities as the best place to go?
It's difficult, isn't it? I think you have this automatic sense that these are the 2 most elite universities in the country. And yet in terms of what you're judging universities on, teaching, research, endowing students with employability skills, their ability to be a sensible member of the public, an intelligent citizen, if you like. I don't think Oxford and Cambridge necessarily have the monopoly on that. There's plenty of wonderful universities out there, each with their own special strengths. I think what the report is showing that Oxford and Cambridge simply haven't gone far enough. They're recruiting solely either from the City of London or from the home counties, so they have a geographic preference.
But they're saying they spent millions on outreach work, improving social
They may
mobility.
do, but the figures don't bear that out at this point, unfortunately.
And particularly for Kent, there's a problem, isn't there, in terms of numbers? It's quite surprising that
yes.
David Lammy's stats for the South East generally show a lot of students do go there, but not necessarily from Kent.
Not necessarily from Kent,
Why
exactly
is that?
right. I suppose in Kent there's a sense that perhaps maybe either Oxford and Cambridge in terms of educational elite entities just don't appeal, and I think some of the messages that we got from that clip there suggest that. But perhaps the universities themselves are simply not reaching out. They're not saying you can do it too. You're the new kind of student that we would love to have here, regardless of economic background, regardless of social background.
Does that changing culture start at schools?
It has to start at school, and I don't think it just has to start in high school. One of the young ladies said that, of course, if you go to a grammar school, you might get Oxford and Cambridge arriving and trying to recruit you, but I think it needs to go further and further back, and endowing students, girls and boys alike, with the understanding that there are areas in which simply hard work and attentiveness and interest can get you very, very far, but at the same time not say that these are the only options. That's a very elitist view itself.
Clive, are you worried by these statistics, or do they simply mirror what a lot of people probably have suspected?
This isn't an old problem. It goes back a number of years. Reports in the past have indicated the same problem. The universities, Oxbridge universities, claim to be seeking to address it. The proof of the pudding is in the eating, and still in 2015 40% of Oxbridge undergrads were from public schools.
So what aren't they doing which they should be doing?
I think, as Amelia says, that there's an ethos and a message that needs to be got over. There are many high-achieving students in Kent, many who, from their A-level results, would be more than capable of going to Oxbridge. My feeling is that Oxbridge doesn't give the right messages to indicate that they would be welcome, and students will see reports such as this and think, well, why should I go when clearly it's not for me, is how they would feel about it.
Anything particularly you'd like to see being done by the university or perhaps the schools, Amelia?
I think the schools should have a more sensible message to spread to students as a whole, very much based on excellence, but I think a stress probably on STEM research as well, so the idea of pushing women in particular into science so that there's more of a gender balance. At Canterbury Christchurch, I think we're very, very keen not to be seen specifically as a regional university, but as a university that endows students with great employability statistics.
Well, you got your plug in for your employer.
I did.
I'm afraid we've got to wrap up there. That's all from us here at Paul on Politics. Thanks to our guests tonight for coming into the studio. We'll be back soon. In the meantime, you can catch up on all the latest political news in Kent by logging on to kentonline.co.uk or listening to KM FM. Thanks for watching. Good night.